Welcome to Top 10 Secret, the place where we uncover the scariest and most chilling mysteries you've never heard of. Today, we bring you Geste, the top 10 most terrifying and haunting ghost stories. From the little girl in the misty village, with her hollow, glowing eyes, the haunted corridor, filled with agonizing screams, the cursed swamp, where lost souls are forever trapped, to the curse of the Death Guide. A path that once entered offers no return, but the most horrifying tale of all, ranking at number 1 on today's list, is the Curse of the Death Sword. An ancient blade cursed by darkness, stealing the soul of anyone who dares to touch it, turning them into eternal prisoners of death. Haunted by endless whispers and an inescapable fate. Do you have the courage to continue listening? Or will you turn off the lights, cover your ears, and pray that you're not the next victim? Story 1. The Curse of the Death Sword. In a distant land, hidden among ominous mountains and dark forests, a legend has been passed down through generations. It is the tale of the Dark Sword King, a once invincible warrior who, driven by overwhelming ambition, betrayed the gods and was eternally cursed. His soul could never find peace, doomed to wander this world, waiting for a foolish soul to take up his sword. It is said that the sword is not merely a weapon, but a gateway to hell. Anyone who draws it from its sheath is cursed, inheriting the Dark Sword King's fate. A deathless warrior shackled by the thirst for blood, forced to kill to maintain existence. No one knows where the sword lies, but one thing is certain: whoever seeks it never returns. Jake, a young and ambitious warrior, always longed to be the strongest. He heard the legend of the Dark Sword King and could not resist the temptation of ultimate power. Despite warnings, Jake was determined to embark on his quest for the legendary sword. His journey led him deep into the forest, where towering ancient trees intertwined, blocking out the sunlight. Whispers echoed in the darkness, unseen eyes watching his every step. But Jake felt no fear. He pressed on until he discovered an ancient temple buried beneath layers of moss and decay. Inside the temple, everything was covered in cobwebs and the skeletal remains of those who had come before. In the center of the dark chamber, a black stone pedestal stood tall, and upon it lay the cursed sword. The air grew heavy, as if thousands of eyes were locked onto him. A deep, guttural voice echoed in Jake's mind. "Draw me, and power shall be yours." Cold sweat trickled down his spine, but Jake slowly reached out. His fingers trembled as they touched the icy hilt. A surge of black energy erupted, enveloping his body. And then, he pulled the sword from its sheath. Everything around him vanished. Only Jake remained, standing in a pitch-black void, facing a towering figure, the Dark Sword King. He was no longer human. His skeletal frame was cloaked in tattered black robes, his eyes burning pits of fire. In his grip was a sword identical to Jake's, drenched in blood. "Now you are me, I am you," the chilling voice resounded. Jake felt his body changing. His flesh shriveled, his hair fell away, and his bones began to emerge. He could not scream. He could not flee. The curse had begun. Jake did not die, but he was no longer human. He returned to his village after weeks of absence, but no one recognized him. His face had changed, his eyes became void of emotion, and at times, bloodstains appeared on his hands with no memory of how they got there. Every night he heard whispers from the sword. "Kill, kill, the blood will sustain you." At first, Jake resisted, but the temptation was too strong. He started with small animals, then moved on to people. His first victims vanished without a trace. Villagers whispered about a monster lurking in the shadows. Then, the fateful night arrived. Under the blood-red moon, Jake entered the village, sword in hand. There was no mercy left in him, no restraint. He slaughtered everyone, men, women, children. None escaped the wrath of the cursed blade. When the night ended, the village was nothing but ruins, corpses stacked upon one another. And in the midst of it all, Jake stood, his eyes burning red, his body reduced to a skeletal form, gripping the blood-soaked sword. He had become the new Dark Sword King. From then on, Jake wandered endlessly across lands, seeking new victims to sustain his existence. Along his path, he encountered demon hunters, monks, and exorcists who sought to break the curse, but none could defeat him. Over time, Jake learned to control the sword, wielding its dark power to carve his name into history as a blood-soaked legend. Kingdoms fell, empires crumbled, and souls were devoured. But deep within his decayed spirit, Jake knew he was merely part of an endless cycle. One day, someone else would come, tempted by the sword's call, and he would be forced to pass on his throne. And when the blood moon rose once more, the story would begin again. Story 2. The Curse of the Death Guide. The legend of the Grey Forest has existed for centuries. It is said that anyone who enters this forest at night never returns, not because of wild beasts, but because of an ancient entity that guards this place, the Death Guide. A figure clad in a tattered black cloak, wearing a tall hat, holding a staff made of bones, and with eyes glowing red like burning embers. Anyone who dares to trespass on his land will be cursed forever. A group of 4 young people, Jack, Michael, Lisa, and Emily, did not believe in those tales. They were thrill seekers, lovers of adventure, and unafraid to challenge legends. One moonless evening, the group decided to venture into the forest to verify the truth. The skeletal branches intertwined, blocking the dim moonlight. The eerie silence was only disturbed by the rustling of dried leaves beneath their feet. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine, but she brushed off the fear and continued forward. They set up camp in a small clearing in the forest. Jack started a fire while Emily and Michael prepared a simple dinner. Just as they settled in, a piercing shriek echoed through the stillness. It was unlike anything they had ever heard before. "We should really turn back," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Are you scared?" Michael sneered. But something feels off." Emily clutched her coat tightly. Suddenly, footsteps echoed through the silent forest, but they weren't their own. The sound dragged along, slow, heavy, as if some unseen entity was approaching. Jack shone his flashlight ahead. The beam illuminated a withered tree trunk. But then, behind it, a tall, shadowy figure emerged. Its glowing red eyes pierced the darkness. "What the hell is that?" Michael stepped back, his voice shaking. The shadowy figure curled its lips into a sinister grin, revealing pale, lifeless teeth. It held a staff made of human bones, and beside it, a skeletal corpse sneered, raising its bony middle finger in mockery. Jack screamed and bolted. The others followed in panic. But the space around them twisted unnaturally. The trees stretched as if they were breathing. The wind howled, carrying the tormented screams of countless souls. A cold, clammy hand gripped Lisa's shoulder. She turned, locking eyes with the glowing red gaze. Its mouth opened, exhaling a rancid breath into her face. Lisa shrieked and collapsed. Michael and Emily pulled her up, forcing their legs to move. But each step felt like they were sinking deeper into a never-ending swamp. They ran endlessly, yet the forest had no exit. After hours of fleeing, Michael was suddenly yanked into the darkness. Jack and Emily turned, but he was gone. Only a blood-soaked trail stretched across the ground. "We have to get out of here!" Emily screamed in terror. They kept running, but at some point, they realized they had ended up right where they started. Standing before them, the death guide remained motionless. Beside him lay a pile of bones, and among them, Michael's fractured skull with 2 hollow eye sockets. Jack and Emily screamed, but no one could hear them. The surrounding trees twisted, their long, gnarled branches reaching toward them. Emily was dragged into the darkness. Her screams were abruptly silenced. Jack lunged forward, grasping at a branch, but it was useless. An unseen force lifted him into the air, then slammed him to the ground. His entire body was paralyzed, only able to watch as the dark entity stepped closer, its glowing red eyes fixed on him. "What do you want?" Jack stammered. The death guide leaned in, placing a finger on his forehead. "A new soul. For eternity." Jack felt an excruciating pain. His body convulsed, his flesh rotting away, peeling from his bones. He screamed, but his throat emitted only dry, cracking sounds. His body shriveled, withered. And then, there was only a grinning skeleton standing beside the death guide. From that moment on, the forest gained a new skeleton, waiting for the next unfortunate souls. Years later, another group of tourists ventured into the forest. They laughed at the ghost stories, oblivious to the glowing red eyes watching them from the shadows. The death guide has never stopped. He is always waiting for new souls to continue his curse. Story 3. The Curse of the Swamp. The locals called it the Drowned Swamp. No one dared to go near it, especially after the sun dipped below the horizon. Legend spoke of an ancient curse, of restless souls lurking beneath the stagnant waters, of the drowned ones who never found peace. Deep in the heart of this forsaken land, where the air reeked of decay and the trees bent unnaturally as if whispering to one another, a group of explorers arrived, completely unaware of the horrors awaiting them. Jacob, an ambitious biologist, led the expedition. He had heard the tales but dismissed them as mere folklore. He was here for science, for discovery, for glory. With him were his assistant Laura, a skeptical journalist named Daniel, and their local guide, Miguel, who had grown up in a village not far from the swamp. Miguel had warned them, "We should not be here. The swamp remembers those who intrude." Jacob laughed, shaking his head. "Superstition won't stop progress, Miguel. We have work to do." As night fell, the swamp seemed to come alive. The wind carried with it a strange, distant wailing, and the air turned thick, suffocating. Their boat drifted slowly through the black waters, tangled in vines that slithered like the fingers of something unseen. Strange bubbles surfaced near them, rising from an unfathomable depth. And then they saw it. A skeletal figure emerged from the murky depths, its flesh rotting, covered in moss and algae. Hollow sockets that once housed eyes now glowed faintly with an eerie blue light. It opened its mouth, emitting a guttural sound that made the very air tremble. Laura screamed. Daniel fumbled with his camera, but his hands were shaking too much. Miguel gripped the side of the boat, whispering frantic prayers under his breath. "You should not have come." The voice was neither human nor animal. It was something far worse, something that belonged to the forgotten abyss. Jacob, still in denial, stepped forward, his scientific curiosity outweighing his fear. What are you?" he stammered. The creature lifted an arm, and the water around them churned violently. The boat rocked uncontrollably. Dark shapes moved beneath the surface. More of them. More drowned ones waking from their slumber. Then something grabbed Laura's ankle. She shrieked as she was yanked downward, her body disappearing under the swamp before anyone could react. A horrible gurgling sound echoed, followed by silence. "Laura!" Jacob lunged forward, but Miguel pulled him back. "She's gone," Miguel shouted. "We need to leave." But it was too late. A wave of grotesque, decayed hands shot up from the water, grabbing at the boat. Their skeletal fingers dug into wood and flesh alike. Daniel let out a strangled scream as something pulled him under. His camera flashed one last time before the darkness swallowed him whole. Jacob and Miguel tried to fight back, but the swamp was relentless. Miguel kicked, struggled, cursed, but the waters consumed him, his voice lost in a sea of wailing spirits. Jacob was the last one left. He barely managed to scramble onto a nearby fallen tree, gasping, his breath ragged. The drowned figures stood just beneath the surface, their glowing eyes fixed upon him, waiting, watching. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself, the swamp spoke again. "You belong to us now." The following morning, a rescue team found the abandoned boat, half submerged, covered in moss and claw marks. No bodies were ever recovered. But some nights, under the full moon, villagers swore they could see figures standing at the edge of the swamp. Figures with hollow eyes, their wet, rotting flesh hanging from their bones. And if you listened closely, you could still hear their voices in the wind. You should not have come. The swamp's new prey. Jacob clung to the log, his entire body shaking from exhaustion and horror. The swamp had taken his crew, and now it was calling for him. The water rippled around him as if the drowned ones were waiting, savoring the fear that emanated from him. "No, I won't die here," he whispered, forcing himself to move. His limbs ached, his skin was numb from the cold swamp water, but survival instinct pushed him forward. He could see a faint light in the distance, perhaps the search team, perhaps salvation. Crawling along the log, he inched closer to the shore. Every movement sent echoes across the water, but the figures beneath remained still, their glowing eyes watching his every move. Then, the light flickered. Jacob froze. The light twisted and contorted unnaturally, shifting colors, and then it split into two small, glowing orbs. It wasn't a rescue team. It was them. A putrid hand shot up from the log, gripping Jacob's arm. It was wet, decomposed, with blackened nails that dug into his flesh. He screamed, trying to shake it off, but another hand emerged, then another. They had been waiting for him to tire. Jacob thrashed, kicking and clawing, but the hands only tightened their grip, pulling him downward. Water rushed over his face. He held his breath, but the murky liquid forced itself into his nose, his throat, his lungs. The last thing he saw was their faces. Twisted, ghoulish, their gaping mouths whispering secrets of the abyss. You belong to us now. A new legend is born. Days later, another group of travelers arrived at the swamp, drawn by the same curiosity, the same foolish bravery. The locals pleaded with them not to go, but they laughed off the warnings. The search team had recovered nothing. No bodies, no traces. Only whispers in the wind and eerie footprints that led into the swamp, but never came back. One by one, the villagers closed their doors as night fell, muttering the same words passed down through generations. The swamp never lets go of what it takes. And as the moon rose high, the waters of the swamp stirred again, eager for new souls to claim. The whispers returned, carried on the wind, weaving through the trees. You should not have come. Story 4. The Curse of the Reaper. For centuries, the village of Ravenshade has whispered of a being lurking beyond the dead forest, where twisted trees stood like skeletal fingers against the sky. They called him the Reaper, a dark entity who was neither alive nor dead, a collector of wandering souls who dared trespass into his domain. The stories were always the same. Those who entered the forest at night never returned, and those who glimpsed the hooded figure with skeletal hands were doomed to a fate worse than death. But legends were just that. Stories passed through generations to keep people from wandering too far. Or so they thought. A group of paranormal investigators, Lucas, Henry, Rachel, and Emily, arrived at Ravenshade, eager to debunk the village's folklore. They had heard the tales, the warnings, but dismissed them as rural superstition. Armed with cameras, audio recorders, and the confidence of those who had never seen true horror, they ventured into the Forest of the Forgotten just as dusk set in. It's all psychological, Lucas, the group's leader, assured them. Mass hysteria, nothing more. Miguel, the village's eldest storyteller, watched them go with vacant, knowing eyes. Before they left, he muttered a single warning. The Reaper does not take kindly to those who mock his existence. The words lingered in the air long after the group disappeared into the trees. As night fell, the forest transformed. The temperature plummeted unnaturally, and a dense fog slithered between the trees, swallowing the moonlight. Their flashlights flickered, as though the darkness itself was feeding on the light. Rachel stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. A dry rustling, like brittle bones scraping together, echoed through the silence. A low, guttural breath followed. Emily turned, her voice shaking. "It's probably an animal." But deep down, she knew no animal made sounds like that. Then came the whispering, not in any recognizable language, but guttural, ancient, and malevolent. It slithered through the air, surrounding them, seeping into their very bones. Their equipment crackled with static. Then they saw him. A hooded figure stood between the trees, unmoving, his hollow eyes glowing like burning embers. His skeletal fingers curled into claws, as if beckoning them closer. A scream tore through the silence as Rachel was dragged backward by an unseen force. She clawed at the ground, her nails peeling away as she was yanked into the mist. The others ran. Lucas, Henry, and Emily stumbled blindly through the fog, their breathing ragged. Lucas turned his flashlight behind them, only to see the hooded figure now much closer, his bony grin stretching impossibly wide. Henry tripped, landing hard. Before he could push himself up, skeletal hands burst from the earth, wrapping around his limbs. "Help me!" he shrieked, but the others could only watch in horror as he was dragged underground, his screams muffled by the dirt that swallowed him whole. Lucas and Emily ran, but no matter which direction they turned, the forest stretched endlessly. The trees twisted, forming grotesque faces that whispered unintelligibly. Emily fell to her knees, sobbing. "We're not getting out, are we?" Lucas gritted his teeth. "We have to try." A hand landed on his shoulder. He turned slowly, his breath caught in his throat. The Reaper stood behind him. Lucas had time to let out a strangled cry before the darkness consumed him. Emily was the last one standing. Her flashlight had long since died, and all around her the forest whispered with voices that weren't human anymore. Then, the whispers stopped. Silence. A skeletal hand extended from the darkness, beckoning her forward. Her body was no longer her own. She moved involuntarily, stepping into the shadows where the Reaper waited. His hollow eyes stared deep into hers, and she felt her soul unravel, piece by piece. Emily opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. She was frozen, trapped in an endless moment of horror. Then she was gone. The villagers found their abandoned equipment near the edge of the forest, but there was no sign of them. "They never learn," Miguel murmured, shaking his head. And that night, under the blood-red moon, new whispers echoed from the trees, new voices added to the choir of the damned. The Reaper had claimed his prize, and he was still waiting, for the next ones to come. Story 5. The Angel of Death. The village of Black Hollow had long feared the whispers of the old, crumbling church on the outskirts of town. For centuries, stories had circulated of the Angel of Death, a dark figure draped in tattered robes, with skeletal hands and wings as black as the void. They said that whenever the church bells tolled at midnight, a soul would be taken, and that the angel's embrace was colder than death itself. No one had seen it and lived to tell the tale. But the villagers knew. When the crows took flight, when the air turned thick with mist, when the whispers of lost souls echoed through the trees, the angel had arrived. One stormy autumn evening, a young girl named Evelyn fell deathly ill. Her parents, desperate and grief-stricken, sought help from every healer, every priest, but nothing could cure her. As the clock struck midnight, the wind howled through the village and the old church bell rang, a deep, resonating sound that chilled the soul. The villagers locked their doors, whispered prayers under their breath, and waited. Then, the air grew deathly silent. A figure emerged from the mist, standing tall and motionless at the entrance of Evelyn's home. Its wings stretched out like a shadow consuming the light. In its skeletal hands, it cradled a sleeping child. A child who no longer belonged to the world of the living. The angel had taken her. But Evelyn did not cry. She did not scream. She looked into the hollow sockets of the angel's skull and whispered, "Where are we going?" The angel did not respond. It merely turned, spreading its wings as darkness swallowed them both whole. The villagers never spoke of Evelyn again. Her home remained untouched, frozen in time, as if her presence still lingered. But as the years passed, rumors surfaced of a spectral child wandering the graveyard at night, her eyes glowing like pale embers in the dark. Some claimed she whispered to them, warning them to stay away from the church. Others said she was seen standing beside the angel itself, a new soul bound to its eternal service. And then, the tolling of the bell began again. One by one, the children of Black Hollow began disappearing. Each time, the crows would take flight, the mist would rise, and the angel would appear, carrying yet another innocent soul into the abyss. The villagers tried to flee, but the angel's reach was endless. Those who left the village found themselves drawn back, their dreams plagued by visions of hollow-eyed children and skeletal wings wrapping around them. No matter how far they ran, the sound of the church bell followed. One night, a young woman named Lillian, grieving the loss of her sister, dared to confront the entity. Armed with nothing but a lantern and the name of the lost, she entered the church where no one had set foot in centuries. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, the wooden pews rotting, and the altar draped in cobwebs. And then, she saw them. Rows of children stood in silence, their bodies draped in tattered garments, their eyes empty voids. At the center stood Evelyn, her once golden hair now pale as the moon, her tiny hand resting in the skeletal grip of the angel. "Why have you come?" Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper, yet it echoed through the ruined walls. "I came to take you home," Lillian said, stepping forward, her voice trembling. "This isn't where you belong." Evelyn tilted her head, her hollow eyes flickering with something unreadable. "I am home." The angel's wings unfurled, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Lillian's breath came out in a thick fog, her lantern's light flickering. "You cannot take what has already been claimed." The angel's voice was a rasping breath. more ancient than time itself. The children began to move, their hands reaching out, their whispers growing louder, incomprehensible. Lillian tried to run, but the shadows clung to her, pulling her toward them. Cold fingers brushed against her skin, and the last thing she saw was Evelyn's smile, sorrowful yet accepting. And then, darkness. When dawn broke, the village of Black Hollow was silent. The church, once decrepit and forgotten, stood tall once more, its bell gleaming as if newly cast. The villagers who remained never spoke of Lillian again, but the children still disappeared. The whispers never faded. The bell continued to toll, and the angel of death still waited, patient and eternal, for the next soul to claim. No one escapes the embrace of the angel. Years passed, and Black Hollow became nothing more than an abandoned ghost town. The houses crumbled, the streets were overgrown, and the old church stood alone, silent, waiting. But deep within the rotting pews, something stirred. One night, under a sky devoid of stars, a lone traveler named Elias found himself lost. The village was not on any map, nor did it seem to belong to any time. The air was thick, suffocating, yet something compelled him forward. He walked through the deserted streets, past ruined homes, toward the towering church at the village's heart. The door creaked open at his touch, revealing an unnatural darkness beyond. The pews were empty, save for the faint whisper of long-departed souls. Elias stepped inside, drawn toward the altar where a massive iron bell loomed overhead, covered in dust yet strangely untouched by time. Then it rang. The vibrations shook the air, sending ripples through the silence. Elias turned, and there, at the far end of the church, stood the angel of death. It spread its wings, and the shadows swallowed the light. Elias stumbled backward, heart pounding. The whispering grew louder until it was deafening. Then the children emerged, their hollow eyes fixated on him, their mouths moving in silent prayer. Evelyn stepped forward, her small hands reaching out. "You were meant to come here," she whispered. "You were always meant to come." The angel extended its skeletal hand, its touch as cold as the grave. Elias felt his strength leave him, his soul unraveling, pulled into the void where countless others had gone before. His scream never left the church, and when morning came, the church stood silent once more, its bell gleaming under the pale light. The angel had claimed another soul, and it was still waiting for the next to come. Story 6. The Haunted Ward. For decades, St. Marianne Hospital stood as an abandoned monument to suffering. It was once a place of healing, but after a string of horrific deaths, it was shuttered and left to decay. The building loomed over the town like a tombstone, a reminder of the horrors that had transpired within its crumbling walls. The locals whispered about Hallway 13, the forbidden corridor where a patient named Lillian had vanished years ago. She had been confined to room 306, a patient who had once pleaded for help, screaming about the voices that called to her from the walls. Then, one night, she disappeared, without opening the locked door. The only trace of her was a single white gown left crumpled on the floor, soaked in something dark. The hospital had been abandoned soon after, but some said Lillian never left. A team of paranormal investigators, led by David Carter, a skeptical doctor, entered St. Marianne one night, determined to uncover the truth. He was accompanied by his research assistant, Sarah, a historian named Greg, and their cameraman, Nick. "It's just a building," David scoffed as they stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. "Whatever happened here is long over." But as the door creaked shut behind them, sealing them in, something shifted in the air. The silence wasn't just silence. It was waiting. The group moved through the ruined corridors, the walls peeling with age, the scent of mildew thick in the air. Something was wrong. The layout of the hospital didn't match the blueprint Sarah had studied. Hallways twisted in unfamiliar directions. Rooms appeared where they shouldn't. Then came the first sign that they were not alone. Sarah stopped abruptly, her breath hitching. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. A slow, dragging sound echoed down the hall, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. The group exchanged uneasy glances before cautiously moving toward the sound. They found room 306. The door was slightly ajar, the metal handle rusted. Greg hesitated, then pushed it open. Inside, the room was untouched by time. The bed was made, the air stale yet undisturbed. And in the corner, facing away from them, stood a woman in a white gown. Her hair hung in thick black strands down her back, swaying as if caught in a non-existent breeze. Nick raised his camera, his fingers trembling. "Miss?" he called softly. The woman turned. Her face was a mask of pure horror. Her eyes black voids, her mouth stretched impossibly wide, a hollow grin filled with jagged, broken teeth. And then the lights went out. Screams filled the air. The darkness swallowed them whole. Nick's camera hit the ground, spinning, capturing brief flashes of shadowy figures crawling on the walls. David reached for Sarah's hand but found nothing. The air grew thick, suffocating, as whispers slithered into his ears. "Stay with me." A cold hand wrapped around his wrist. He turned. Lillian was inches from his face. Her gaping mouth emitted a soundless wail, her fingers digging into his flesh, pulling him toward her endless abyss of a mouth. He screamed, thrashing, but her strength was inhuman. Then he fell into a darkness deeper than death. The next morning, when authorities searched the hospital, they found only Nick's camera, its lens shattered. The footage showed the team walking into room 306. Then, static. Then, a frame of Lillian standing behind them, her black eyes gleaming. No bodies were ever recovered. But if you stand outside St. Marianne Hospital at night, you can still hear the echoes of their screams. And if you enter hallway 13, you might see a figure standing at the end of the corridor, her long hair flowing, her empty eyes locked onto you. Waiting. The hospital calls. Again, months after the disappearance of the investigative team, St. Marianne remained sealed. Yet, the whispers never stopped. Some claimed to see shadowy figures moving past the boarded windows, while others swore they heard faint sobbing from inside the hospital at night. A group of thrill-seekers, ignoring the warnings, decided to enter the hospital to uncover the mystery themselves. They carried high-tech ghost hunting equipment and cameras, convinced they would capture what happened to David and his team. As soon as they stepped inside, the temperature plummeted. The smell of rot and mildew filled their noses. Something felt wrong. They walked through the abandoned halls, recording everything. But no matter how far they moved forward, they always found themselves back at room 306. Then, a voice. Software gentle. "Help me." A girl's voice, barely more than a whisper, echoed from within the room. One of them, a young man named Brian, cautiously pushed open the door. The room was empty, except for an old hospital bed covered in rotting sheets. And then, the door slammed shut. The group screamed, pounding against the walls, but the air in the room grew thick, suffocating. The shadows in the corners began to move, taking shape. Then Lillian appeared. She stood in the doorway, her hollow eyes locked onto them. Her head tilted unnaturally to the side as she smiled, a grotesque, wide grin splitting her face apart. Stay with me forever. The hospital trembled. The walls bled black ichor. The ceiling lights exploded. And the last thing the group saw before darkness claimed them was Lillian lunging toward them. The next morning, the hospital remained silent. The thrill-seekers were never found. But their equipment was left behind, neatly stacked in the center of hallway 13. The camera was still recording. And on the footage, a single frame captured Lillian's face, grinning. She was still waiting. Story 7. The Whispers of St. Dismas. The old St. Dismas Asylum stood at the edge of Greywood, its crumbling silhouette looming like a tombstone against the blood-red horizon. It had been abandoned for over 50 years after a fire had ravaged its halls, consuming patients and staff alike in an inferno of agony. But the stories of what truly happened inside its walls stretched back much further than the fire. It was said that something evil had taken root in St. Dismas, a force that thrived on suffering, that fed on the minds of the broken. The patients, already lost to madness, had begun whispering to the walls, speaking to something unseen. Some had clawed out their own eyes, claiming they had seen the real face of St. Dismas. Others had vanished overnight, their empty rooms reeking of something rotten and wrong. No one knew why the fire had started. But the townspeople never tried to rebuild. They left it to rot, hoping the ghosts would be satisfied. But some things never rest. In 2023, a group of ghost hunters decided to break into St. Dismas and document their exploration. They called themselves Phantom Seekers, a YouTube group known for debunking haunted places. The team consisted of James, their leader and skeptic, Lisa, their tech expert, Eric, the cameraman, and Tom, the fearless one who always volunteered to go first. Their plan was simple: spend the night inside St. Dismas, capture as much paranormal evidence as possible, and prove that the legends were nothing more than urban myths. They were wrong. They entered the asylum through a shattered window, stepping over broken glass and crumbling debris. The air was heavy, thick with mildew and something metallic, something that smelled like old blood. Their flashlights flickered, the batteries draining faster than usual. Lisa frowned. "That's weird. We just put in fresh batteries?" "Probably just the atmosphere messing with the electronics," James said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. As they made their way through the halls, the first thing they noticed was the silence. It wasn't the normal silence of an abandoned building. It was an unnatural quiet, as if the asylum itself was holding its breath. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, like the wind slithering through the walls. Then louder, unmistakable. Voices speaking in unison, chanting, calling. Lisa's radio crackled. A single word came through the static. "Run." Tom laughed nervously. "Okay, that was creepy. Someone probably left a radio signal running." James nodded, regaining some of his composure. "Let's keep moving. We're looking for room 306. That's where most of the supposed sightings have happened." They moved deeper into the asylum, passing rusted wheelchairs, overturned gurneys, and old hospital beds with decayed leather straps, restraints for the worst patients. The deeper they went, the more twisted the architecture became. Hallways that should have led in one direction looped back on themselves. Doors led to places that shouldn't exist. Then they found it. Room 306. The door stood slightly ajar, its hinges groaning as Lisa nudged it open with a trembling hand. Inside was a single wheelchair sitting in the center of the room. Nothing else. "That's weird," Eric muttered, lifting his camera. "It looks untouched." Then the wheelchair moved. It rolled forward on its own, the wheels screeching against the cracked tiles. Lisa screamed. Eric dropped the camera. James staggered backward. Then, from the dark corner of the room, a figure emerged. It was a patient's gown, but there was no body inside it. It hovered, the sleeves limp, the cloth breathing as if something unseen was still wearing it. Then it lunged. The team bolted from room 306, their screams echoing down the endless hallways. But no matter how fast they ran, they always ended up back in the same place. The wheelchair was still there, but this time, someone was sitting in it. A patient, or what was left of one. His face was twisted, melted, the flesh barely clinging to bone. His lips curled into a grotesque grin, his hollow sockets locked onto them. "Doctor, you're late for your treatment." The lights went out. Lisa felt something grab her ankle, yanking her to the floor. Cold fingers crawled over her skin, climbing her legs, wrapping around her arms, covering her mouth before she could scream. She was dragged into the dark. James reached for her, but she was gone. The black swallowed her whole. Then the lights flickered back on. Lisa's body was still there, but her face was gone. Skin peeled away, eyes ripped out, lips stretched into a silent scream. Her features had been taken, her body left behind. Eric collapsed in horror. Tom vomited. James stood frozen. Then the whispers returned. "You stay with us forever." James, Eric, and Tom ran, but the asylum had shifted around them. The doors were gone. The windows showed only darkness. Then they saw them. The patients, dozens of them crawling from the shadows, their faces missing, their mouths moving silently. One by one, the remaining members of Phantom Seekers were taken. Tom was pulled into an empty gurney, the straps winding around him by themselves, tightening until his bones snapped. Eric was dragged into a black doorway, his fingers leaving bloody streaks on the tile as he disappeared. James was the last. He turned a corner, and there it was. The wheelchair. The figure sitting in it smiled. James fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Please." The figure raised a single rotting finger to its lips. "Shh." The lights went out one last time, and James was gone. A week later, police found the team's van still parked outside the asylum. Inside, the car was covered in bloody handprints. The camera was found, but the footage was corrupted, except for one frame. A wheelchair, and in the seat, 4 new patients. Their faces were stretched, warped into permanent silent screams. And the whispers of St. Dismas never stopped. They still wait for the next ones to enter. Story 8, Ritual of the Damned. The cemetery of Blackwood had long been a place of whispered legends and chilling superstitions. Under the pale light of a full moon, the gravestones cast long, crooked shadows across the earth, and the wind carried with it the scent of decay and something far worse, something that did not belong to this world. No one dared enter the graveyard past midnight, not since the stories of those who had tried and never returned. It was said that a ritual could be performed in the heart of the graveyard, one that would summon a spirit from the beyond. But the price of such a summoning was something that few had ever lived to speak of. Amara had spent years researching forbidden texts, searching for the ritual that could bridge the gap between life and death. Her obsession had grown beyond curiosity. It had become an unrelenting hunger. She no longer feared the consequences. She only craved the knowledge that lay hidden in the darkness. On the night of Samhain, when the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest, Amara ventured into Blackwood Cemetery. Dressed in white, her long hair flowing like ink against her pale skin, She carried with her the tools of her dark craft: a circle of salt, a grimoire bound in ancient leather, and a dagger said to have once belonged to a witch executed centuries ago. She knelt in the center of the circle, placing candles at precise points, whispering incantations that made the air tremble around her. The wind died. The crickets ceased their song. A stillness so unnatural settled over the cemetery that it felt as if time itself had stopped. And then, the whispers began. Soft at first, like echoes through the trees. Then louder, rising from the graves themselves, the voices of the long dead speaking in a language no mortal should understand. The flames of the candles flickered violently, twisting in ways that defied nature. The salt circle darkened, as though something unseen had stepped over its boundary. A figure emerged from the shadows, a towering specter draped in a flowing shroud of tattered white, its skeletal hands reaching outward, its hollow eyes burning with an eerie, unholy light. The very air around it rippled with cold malice. It had no lips, yet it spoke, its voice like a chorus of the damned, layered and broken. "You have called me forth, mortal. What is it you seek?" Amara swallowed her fear, her hands trembling. "I wish for knowledge, to understand the secrets of death." The specter chuckled, a sound that scraped against reality itself. "Knowledge comes at a price. Are you willing to pay?" She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yes." The entity lifted one bony hand, and the air around them darkened. Shadows coiled like living tendrils, slithering towards Amara. Her breath hitched as her body froze in place, her limbs no longer her own. And then the pain began. It started as a whisper beneath her skin, crawling like insects through her veins, growing worse with every second. It burrowed deep, twisting her bones, stretching her flesh. She tried to scream, but her voice had been stolen. Her vision blurred as she saw herself, her body standing rigid while something else entered it. She was being pushed out. The specter exhaled, a gust of unnatural wind swirling as it stepped into her skin. Her consciousness was thrown into an abyss, plummeting into endless, suffocating darkness. The last thing she saw before she was swallowed whole was her own face smiling back at her. But it was no longer hers. The next morning, the townspeople found the cemetery in ruins. The ground had been upturned, gravestones shattered as if something had clawed its way out from beneath them. At the center of the wreckage sat Amara, or what looked like her. Her eyes, once vibrant, were now pitch-black voids. Her lips curled into a knowing smile, as though she were in on a terrible secret. She walked out of the cemetery that morning, silent, unblinking, leaving behind footprints that burned into the soil. And from that day forward, no one ever saw Amara again. But people whispered of a woman who walked the roads at night, her white dress drifting behind her, her empty eyes scanning the world with an insatiable hunger. The one who had summoned death and become its vessel. Amara's presence did not simply vanish. Strange occurrences plagued the village of Blackwood in the weeks that followed. People reported hearing whispers in their homes at night, voices that mirrored their own but spoke of things that should not be known. Farm animals were found slaughtered in their pens, their eyes missing, their bodies twisted unnaturally. Children spoke of a lady in white standing at the edge of the woods, beckoning them forward. And then, one by one, the villagers began to disappear. First, it was the old priest, Father Mathis, who had warned against meddling with the spirits. He was found at the altar of the church, his body charred as if burned from within, his mouth open in an eternal scream. Then it was Eleanor, the village healer. She vanished into the night, and when her home was searched, they found only a single handprint on the wall, blackened and still warm to the touch. The villagers, now terrified, gathered in the town square demanding answers. They decided to track the source of the horror, and all clues pointed back to Blackwood Cemetery. A group of 6 men, armed with torches and iron blades, made their way into the graveyard under the cover of night. The air was thick with rot, the sky devoid of stars. As they reached the heart of the cemetery, they found a circle of scorched earth, the exact place where Amara had performed the ritual. A sound echoed through the darkness. Laughter. The men turned, their torches flickering. From the mist, she emerged. Amara, or whatever had become of her, stood motionless. Her face was no longer human. It had stretched unnaturally, her mouth impossibly wide, filled with jagged, blackened teeth. Her eyes, voids of endless darkness, reflected nothing but hunger. The men hesitated. Then she moved. Faster than the eye could follow, she was among them. The first man fell, his throat ripped open before he could scream. Another was dragged into the mist, his cries of terror ending in an unnatural gurgle. The last survivor tried to run. He made it to the edge of the graveyard before something cold clutched his ankle. He turned back just in time to see Amara's face inches from his own, her blackened mouth curling into a grin. The ritual is not over. His screams were the last thing Blackwood ever heard of him. The next morning, the village was deserted. Houses stood empty, food still on tables, doors left wide open as if their occupants had simply walked away. And in the graveyard, where the ritual had first been performed, the ground split open once more. The whispers had returned, and they would never stop. She was still waiting. Story 9. The Cursed Candle. The cemetery of Ravenshade had long been a place of whispered legends and silent fear. The villagers knew better than to wander its grounds after dark. Something was wrong with that place. Something old. Something that did not belong to the world of the living. It was not the usual tales of wandering spirits or restless souls that kept people away. It was the candle of the damned. No one knew where the tale had originated, but the warning remained clear. If you light a candle at midnight among the graves, the smoke will reveal the face of someone lost. And if the candle burns out before dawn, they will come for you. Jonas Whitmore, a skeptical journalist with a passion for exposing myths, had arrived in Ravenshade eager to prove the legend false. He had spent years debunking hauntings and superstitions, calling them mere coincidences. He planned to stay the night in the cemetery, light a candle at midnight, and record the entire event. If nothing happened, it would be another successful story for his website. If something did, well, it would make an even better headline. Under the full moon, Jonas walked past the rusting iron gates of Ravenshade, stepping carefully along the overgrown path. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Ancient tombstones jutted from the ground at odd angles, some so weathered that the names had long since faded. In the center of the cemetery stood an old stone altar, cracked and covered in vines. Jonas set up his camera, placed a single white candle on the altar, and checked his watch. 11:59 p.m. He took a deep breath and struck a match. The candle flickered to life, and then the wind died. The crickets stopped chirping. The rustling of the trees ceased. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Jonas exhaled, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. Well, that's eerie, but let's see what happens next. He turned his camera toward the candle, watching as the thin trail of smoke rose into the night sky. At first it moved normally, twisting and curling like any other. But then it stopped dispersing. Instead, it began to form a shape. Long, curling tendrils reaching upward, merging together, thickening into something more than smoke. Jonas felt his stomach drop. The smoke was shaping into a face he recognized. It was his own, a distorted, hollow version of himself, the eyes empty sockets, the mouth open in a silent scream. The image wavered in the air, shifting, twisting, as if something inside it was struggling to break free. Jonas stumbled backward, knocking over his camera. "No, this is a trick," he muttered. "This is just some weird air current, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me." Then the candle snuffed out. The darkness that followed was absolute. A deep, wet gasp echoed through the graveyard. It did not come from Jonas. Something had arrived. Jonas scrambled for his flashlight, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it. When he flicked it on, the beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the swirling mist where the face had been. But now the mist was moving, coming toward him. A voice slithered out of the air, layered and hollow. "You have called me, and now I am free." Jonas turned and ran. The cemetery twisted around him, the gravestones shifting in the darkness, paths appearing where there had been none, others vanishing behind him. He was trapped in a place that no longer followed the rules of reality. His breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted toward the gate. But as he neared it, he saw himself standing there. A perfect replica. Pale, lifeless, watching. It smiled. Jonas screamed as the doppelganger lunged toward him. The villagers found his camera the next morning, still recording. The footage showed the candle flickering, the smoke rising, then static. And in the final frame, just before the battery died, something could be seen standing behind Jonas. Something with his face, something grinning. Jonas was never found, but on certain nights when the mist rolls in, travelers passing through Ravenshade report seeing a man standing among the graves, holding a single lit candle, waiting for someone else to call him forth and take their place. Years passed, and the legend of Jonas became just another ghost story. But one autumn night, a group of thrill seekers, Emily, Carter, and Jake, decided to put the tale to the test. "It's just a story," Carter scoffed, placing a fresh candle on the same stone altar where Jonas had stood. The others hesitated, but eventually gave in to their curiosity. As the match was struck, the wind died. The cemetery fell silent once more. The candle flickered, the smoke twisted. And this time, it did not show a familiar face. It showed three. The faces of Emily, Carter, and Jake, their expressions frozen in terror. Before they could react, the candle blew out on its own. The mist rose, thick and suffocating. Shadows slithered between the tombstones, reaching, grasping. A low whisper carried through the air. "You have called us forth. Now we will take you home." One by one, the shadows swallowed them whole. Their screams were cut off as the mist consumed them entirely, leaving no trace that they had ever been there. The next morning, the villagers discovered 3 fresh graves, their names etched onto newly placed headstones. And on the altar, where the candle had stood, there was now a single matchbox, waiting for the next fool to strike a flame. Story 10: The Fog Children. The village of Black Hollow had always been a place of whispered legends, of hushed warnings passed from generation to generation. It was a town where doors were bolted shut at dusk, where parents kept their children indoors as the autumn winds began to howl. And above all, it was a place where no one dared enter the Wraithwood, the forest at the village's edge, where an unnatural mist lingered, thick and unmoving, even on the windiest nights. People spoke of figures hidden within the fog, of shadows shifting just beyond the tree line. And at the heart of these tales was one figure that haunted every villager's nightmares. A small girl with hollow eyes, always surrounded by grinning specters. For decades, Black Hollow lived in fear, but no one had ever truly sought the truth behind the legend. No one until Martin Hale, a journalist who did not believe in ghosts. Martin was a man of logic, of reason. He had built his career on debunking ghost stories, revealing superstition as nothing more than paranoia and fear. When he heard of Black Hollow's legend, he saw it as just another small-town myth waiting to be disproven. He packed his camera, a notebook, and a flashlight, determined to spend the night in Wraithwood and expose the stories for what they were. Ghost children? Fog that never clears? Please, Martin scoffed as he set out into the trees. Let's see if there's anything scarier out here than damp leaves. But as he crossed the threshold into the mist, the world changed. The moment Martin stepped into the Wraithwood, the silence swallowed him whole. The rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Everything beyond the mist ceased to exist. The world outside had become muffled, like he had been wrapped in thick wool. The further he walked, the denser the fog became, curling around him, pressing against his skin like something alive. Then came the whispers. At first they were faint, giggling, light and playful. Martin turned, expecting to find a hidden speaker, a prank played by the villagers to keep outsiders away. But there was nothing. Only the fog. Then the laughter grew closer. A soft, high-pitched voice whispered his name. Martin, why did you come? A chill ran down his spine. He swung his flashlight wildly, but the beam barely pierced the mist. Shapes flickered at the edges of his vision. Small figures, moving too quickly for his eyes to follow. Then he saw her. A little girl stood between the trees, her pale face peeking through the fog. Her hair was tangled, her dress tattered, her feet bare despite the cold. But it was her eyes that froze Martin in place. Two empty black voids staring straight into his soul. And behind her, more figures began to emerge. Grinning skeletons in tattered cloaks, hollow-eyed phantoms with gaping mouths, crawling figures dragging themselves forward with skeletal hands. They surrounded the girl like guardians, or prisoners. Martin's breath caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. The girl tilted her head. You came to find us. Now you have. The fog exploded around him. Martin stumbled backward, heart hammering against his ribs. The fog twisted, forming grotesque shapes, faces stretching from the mist, screaming silently, reaching for him with clawed hands. The ground beneath him felt wrong, soft and shifting, as if he were standing on something that wasn't solid earth. The girl took a step forward, and with her movement, the specters moved too. Their laughter was all around him now, high-pitched, unnatural, a chorus of madness. Martin turned and ran, but the forest did not let him go. The trees stretched taller, the mist thickened, and the path he had come from was gone. No matter how fast he moved, he always found himself back at the same clearing, staring into those same hollow eyes. The girl reached out a hand. "Stay with us, Martin," she whispered. "Play with us. Forever." Martin screamed. The next morning, the villagers of Black Hollow woke to a thick fog rolling over their fields, denser than they had ever seen before. Something felt different this time, heavier. They found Martin's camera lying just outside Wraithwood, its lens cracked, its battery drained. But Martin himself was nowhere to be seen. When they played the footage, they saw glimpses of shadows moving in the mist, skeletal hands reaching out, empty eyes locking onto the camera. Then, a voice. "You don't believe in us? We'll show you." The final frame was a blurry, distorted image of Martin's face. His mouth stretched in a silent scream, his eyes gone, replaced by twin pools of blackness. From that day on, the fog of Wraithwood never lifted. And if you stand at the edge of the trees long enough, you might hear the laughter of children drifting through the mist, calling for you to join them. Forever. A year passed, and the village of Black Hollow remained cloaked in its eternal fog. The whispers grew louder, and the laughter more frequent. The townspeople no longer ventured near Wraithwood, not even in daylight. The legend of Martin Hale spread beyond the village, drawing the attention of thrill seekers and investigators. One such seeker was Daniel Carter, a documentary filmmaker with a thirst for uncovering the truth. Armed with state-of-the-art cameras, motion sensors, and a team of 4, he set out to do what Martin had failed to: capture definitive proof of the supernatural. Their first night in Black Hollow was quiet, almost eerily so. The villagers refused to speak to them, locking their doors as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. That night, as Daniel reviewed his drone footage, he noticed something peculiar. The fog at the forest's edge moved unnaturally, almost as if it were alive. Ignoring the growing sense of unease, Daniel led his team into Wraithwood at midnight. The laughter began almost immediately. They saw footprints in the damp earth, small, childlike prints that led deeper into the woods. One by one, their equipment malfunctioned. The air turned thick, suffocating. Then, as they pressed on, Daniel saw her, the girl. Standing just as Martin had described, her hollow eyes locked onto them. "You're late," she whispered. The mist rushed forward. The screams of Daniel's team were swallowed by the night. The next morning, their equipment was found outside the forest, the footage showing only glimpses of what had happened. Shadows in the mist, clawed hands reaching, the echoes of desperate cries. But the most chilling part of all was the last frame captured before the camera cut to static. Daniel standing among the fog children, his eyes black voids, smiling.